Today is a day of blessing in many ways. It's All Saints' Day. We remember the saints that have gone before, and we will proclaim the names of those we remember later in our service. And I noticed, I've known, but I really noticed that we actually begin and end our services with blessing. We ask to bless God and to bless one another at the beginning. And we finish with a blessing. In our psalm today, the first verse calls us to bless the Lord at all times, that his praise may ever be in our mouth. And this idea of blessing isn't just about blessing for some people some time ago, somewhere else, a past promise, nor is it just a future hope, but a present reality. And we have for our reading today, for this Feast of All Saints, Jesus talking about the Beatitudes, the blessings. We've been taken right back to the beginning of Jesus' ministry as it's described in Matthew's Gospel, to this teaching that's called the Sermon on the Mount, sometimes also known as the Jesus Manifesto. And it begins with the Beatitudes, which comes from the Latin word beatus, blessed, but actually has an older origin in the Hebrew and the Aramaic that Jesus would have spoken. It was an exclamation. Oh, the blessedness of whatever. Psalm 1 says, oh, the blessedness of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked or take the path that sinners tread or sit in the seat of scoffers. Oh, the blessedness. It's an exclamation. And as I said, it's not about something for the past. It wasn't just for those who heard these blessings for the first time. Not just for the saints that we think of who've lived in the times, in the ages down to today, but speaking into today, speaking of promises in the present as well as blessings to come. Blessings for all kinds of people and all conditions of people. And actually, they seem rather curious, at least they seem rather curious to me, because certainly the circumstances our blessings offer do not seem to be blessings in our 21st century mindset. How can the poor in spirit be blessed? Or those who mourn, or the meek, or the persecuted? How are they blessed? And one thing to say, a really important thing to say, is that the promises of blessing aren't meant to either glorify poverty or to downplay the pain of grief. Another way of describing what blessing is not, I read this earlier this week, blessing is not like a flu shot, because it doesn't immunize us against suffering, and it doesn't protect us from pain or loss. Blessing has more to do with joy than with mere happiness. And for me, these sayings of blessing, the Beatitudes, provide a sense of God's understanding and presence in the joys and sorrows of life, a sense that we're not alone in our struggles, and actually to admit that there are struggles, and that's okay. We can say that. I was listening to the Writer's Almanac on Friday, October 31st, All Hallows Eve, and I discovered that it was actually the day that Martin Luther tacked his 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg. He was a Catholic priest. I don't think it was his intention to do anything other than draw the church that he loved out of some practices he didn't think were the right ones and into good practice. Lots of things we do have unintended consequences. That act was a catalyst, not the only one, but it was one of the catalysts for the Reformation, out of which was born the Church of England. And that's why we are here today, worshiping the way we are. So I was kind of a little bit curious about Martin Luther and discovered that actually his feast day is October 31st because of that being such a memorable occasion. And I was reading about him and discovering that actually he was a pretty straightforward person. He wasn't looking to change a lot. He recognized the marks of the church that had always been held, preaching, sacraments, and he left that pretty much unchanged. But he added a mark of the church, and that was struggle, because he figured that where there is faith, there is always struggle. But the promise, the blessing, is that whatever we confront, poverty of spirit, mourning, persecution, we're not on our own. And that's the promise into which we'll be baptizing William and Isa, Benjamin, Maddox, and Cora today. And what a joy it is to have these 5 children being baptized today. As I mentioned earlier, our gospel reading marks the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And just before his ministry began, 2 things happened. The first thing that happened is that Jesus himself was baptized, followed by his temptation in the desert. And at his baptism, Jesus heard these words from heaven: "This is my Son, the beloved. In him I am well pleased." And I think it's so important to tell this story of Jesus' baptism, because when we come to baptism, either as infants or as adults, I'm not known anybody who themselves has heard that voice from heaven. But today, what we're saying in this place is that God is declaring each of these children God's beloved children, in whom God is well pleased. And I believe that's true for each of us here today. The sacrament of baptism is a sign of God's love for each of us, a sign that we are, each of us, the beloved daughters and sons of God. And that's actually kind of an easy thing to say. It sort of trips off the lips, but it is pretty difficult to believe, or at least it's been difficult for me. Last month, I had the opportunity to spend part of the weekend with the St. John's Youth Group when they went to Mira Vista on retreat. For those of you who don't know Mira Vista, it is an absolutely beautiful and wonderful place in many ways. But a particular joy to me is the enormous labyrinth which the staff kindly set up for us. And if you're not familiar with the labyrinth, some people confuse labyrinths with mazes, but in a labyrinth there are no dead ends. You can't get lost. Probably the most famous labyrinth is the labyrinth on the floor of the cathedral in Chartres in France. And it was used in medieval times as a way of people to make pilgrimage when they couldn't go to the Holy Land. And it's been used for a very long time by people of many faiths to be a way of prayer. And so we had this wonderful labyrinth set up, and there were candles around the edges and some prayer stations. And at the very center of the labyrinth, there was a prayer station with a variation of that verse from Jesus' baptism. "You are my beloved son. You are my beloved daughter. In you I am well pleased." And I've walked various labyrinths with such a prayer station, and when I've arrived in the center and read that verse, "You are my beloved daughter, in whom I am well pleased," I have felt an overwhelming sense of blessing. A sense of blessing that comes from the belief that there's nothing I can do to make God love me more, and there's nothing that I've done or will do in the future that could make God love me less. I am loved. With all my foibles and failures, I am loved unconditionally. And I believe, too, that that is true for each of us here today. There is nothing you can do to make God love you more, and there is nothing you can do to make God love you less. You are loved unconditionally. But it is a work of a lifetime to come to believe that. I'm still working on it. When we read the words of John's first letter, we have that sense of unconditional love of God. Beloved, we are God's children now. Just as the Beatitudes are not promises only for the future, so this reading gives us hope and encouragement that today, now, here, in this place, we are children of God. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. In the next chapter of his letter, John declares, those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. The Beatitudes are an invitation to live in love, to be peacemakers, to be merciful, to hunger and thirst for righteousness, to be prepared to be prophets, even in the face of persecution. To live in love. What might that look like? Henri Nouwen, a 20th century priest, professor, and beloved pastor, wrote this: we choose love by taking small steps of love every time there is an opportunity. A smile, a handshake, a word of encouragement, a phone call, an embrace, a kind greeting, a gesture of support, a moment of attention, a helping hand, a present, a financial contribution, a visit. All these are little steps toward love. Writing quite a bit earlier, John Wesley, the 18th century Anglican divine and theologian, put it in a slightly different way. Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you ever can. Oh, the blessedness of blessing. Rob will bless us in God's name at the end of the service. But I want to offer to you a blessing. It comes from the church I used to serve in England. It's called the Blessing Song. I'm not going to sing it to you. Maybe someday. I'll give Ashley the music and, we'll figure it out. But I invite you now to think about who the saints have been in your life, who has blessed you, and also to think about how you might live in love and be a blessing in our generation to our church, to our community, and to our world. You may find it helpful to close your eyes, but you don't have to. But the blessing song. The blessing of God be upon you and around you, wherever you go. The blessing of God be within you and among you, wherever you go. Wherever you go, whatever you do, the blessing of God go with you. Wherever you go, whatever you do, the blessing of God go with you.